My name is Mike Knowlton. I organize the New York City chapter of Storycode. We're really excited for tonight's presentation. So normally at Storycode, we invite immersive and interactive makers to present their projects. And normally these are projects that are done. They've maybe made the festival circuit or they've launched, and we get great creators to come up and present their awesome work. And I've known Andrew for a very long time, for maybe 15 years or so. And a couple months ago, I was like, oh man, VR is so hot right now. It's so hyped. Wouldn't it be interesting if someone presented a project that wasn't done, that was actually in the middle of production? And that's kind of how we came up with this idea of a mid-production case study, which is not your typical Storycode event. So I'm really excited about it because, as anyone who kind of is familiar in the space, we're kind of figuring this out as we go along, and a lot, especially in the VR space, is kind of being developed by makers that are working on projects right now. So I really thought it might be interesting for a team that's kind of in the midst of it to share what they're thinking about, what they're struggling with, the solutions that they've come up with, and any other insights that they can give us in the middle of a VR project. So come on down, there are some seats up front. So with that, I'll turn it over to Andrew, Albert, Noah, and Patrick, who will be presenting the Yes mid-project VR case study. Production, yes.
So it's interesting, in the introductory remarks from Matt, he was talking about grammar and how language is being developed. And that's really going to be what I'm going to be talking about. Sort of the title of the project is Yes, and this is going to be Yes Experience Design. So obviously experience design is a pretty well-established discipline in the interactive world. When it comes to VR, it's sort of still very much an open territory. And I thought one of the interesting things would be to look back to, especially because we're here in the Lincoln Center and the Film Society, look back to film history and look at how that language developed briefly, and then talk about how that's going to be informing or some lessons learned from that might apply to VR. So for the cinephiles in the audience, Lumiere Brothers, The Arrival of a Train, the English title of that, 1895, one of the earliest films. The Lumiere Brothers and Edison both vie for the claim of being the first people to invent cinema, but there's a lot of experimentation going on at that time. When you look at this film now, it only goes for about 90 seconds. It's a static camera on a tripod, a single shot. But the Lumiere brothers had an interesting approach. They had this machine called a cinematograph, and it was simultaneously a projector and a camera. And they would set up, they didn't have cinemas in those days, of course, so they would set up in these kind of like sideshow carnival tents, and they would have a slide projected of their film on the screen, kind of like in those days they called them magic lanterns, but just a sort of a still image. And people would come in and say, well, this is not that interesting, I've seen this before. And then after a few minutes, all of a sudden they'd hit the projector and the film would come alive. And then people were just like, whoa. It was a little bit like VR in that sense, that, it was this early medium and people had never seen an image move before. The legend has it, I don't know if it's actually true or not, but with this particular film, some of the audience members ran out of the tent screaming because they thought the train was going to come out of the screen. So it did feel like this very, very real environment, but it was incredibly simple, just single shots. Fast forward about 8 years, and then you have Edwin S. Porter, who actually worked for Edison, did a film called The Great Train Robbery, 1903, and that was really kind of what you could call the first modern film. It used editing, which was a completely foreign concept then. You have here as kind of a medium close-up of one of the train robbers, and he actually fires that gun, also very shocking in the cinema when people saw that. And they used to do the sound effects behind the screen. They didn't have sound at that point, so they'd kind of do this diegetic sound to go along with the film. So it took about 8 years from when people were first starting to experiment with film to when they developed the most basic component of film language, which is editing. Obviously, sound came later in the late 20s, and that added a whole other layer to the mix, literally. So there's always going to be new developments, and we'll see that with VR, with things like light cameras coming out down the line that are going to completely change the landscape. But just even that gap between the invention of a medium and the kind of basic component of the language, I think is kind of instructive when we look at VR. But you can say, well, wait a minute, VR's been around for a while, right? Here's Jaron Lanier in 1987 with his VR prototype. And you can tell it's 1987 because you can look at the computers and the TVs in the background. So he coined the term virtual reality. He wasn't the first person to think of it. They were doing experiments at MIT in the 60s. with sort of head-mounted displays. The military has been doing this sort of stuff for a long time. But he kind of popularized it, and there were wide articles and a lot of kind of excitement around it. There was some science fiction, most famously William Gibson with Neuromancer talked about cyberspace, which is in some ways is kind of like an augmented reality with data visualization. Then Neil Stephenson talked in Snow Crash about metaverse and avatars. That was really the popular term. Avatars became a popular term. And so everyone was like, wow, this is going to be amazing. It's kind of incredible. I can't wait to try out VR. And then they tried on some things like this. I love this photo. It's just like this HMD, it just looks so scary. It looks like the face hugger from Alien. And it probably weighs about 20 pounds. But the thing is, the real problem was what was going on inside. The graphics in the video are incredibly low res. There were huge latency issues. You'd try and turn your head and the image would be trying to catch up with the head tracking. The screen quality was terrible. The frame rates were low. And all in all, it was just a really disappointing experience. And there was a lot, like people were trying. I remember trying out VR experiences in the mid-90s, and it's like, wow, this is just not ready for prime time. And so it was one of these things that was like it was overhyped, and then it didn't deliver. And so it kind of went on the back burner for the next 20 years or so. And then coming up to more recent history, something we're more familiar with, the Oculus Rift. And so, Palmer Luckey has pretty much single-handedly revived the possibility of VR. And I think what happened in those 20-odd years, and really in the last sort of 10 years of that, is the arrival of the smartphone. And the iPhone is coming up on its own 10-year anniversary tomorrow. But it sort of, when that came out, it started this space race where everyone, obviously Google and Motorola, and everyone was sort of jumping on the bandwagon and trying to develop their own versions of smartphones, and everything was being sort of made smaller, faster, better. Screen resolutions were getting a lot better. And then also, importantly, there were things like gyrometers and accelerometers, so there was motion tracking in the device as well. And so that became an incredibly important part of a VR experience, because obviously you want to be able to track motion when you're turning your head. So all of those developments meant that Palmer Luckey in his garage could kind of take these components and pull them together with some gaffer's tape and make a prototype that he wanted to raise $250,000, and people saw it, got excited about it, and he raised $2.5 million and then got acquired by Facebook. So it was a pretty happy ending. So, but if you think about that was 2012, the Kickstarter campaign, and as you know, the Oculus HMDs were just released earlier this year. There's Google Cardboard and Samsung Gear a little bit before then. The Vive has just come out. So, the actual entry of HMDs into the consumer market is you could say about a year or at best 2 years old if you count Cardboard. So we're still at that kind of train arriving at the station moment with VR. The language has really still been invented. And that means it's kind of frightening, but there's also a lot of possibilities there. So I'm going to talk now about that transition, and really the biggest thing, and this is something that sort of seems obvious, but when you actually try and do it, you learn how hard it is, but it's a transition from frames to worlds. So frames is obviously cinematic. One of the things that directors are very used to, all the way back to the Great Train Robbery, is they can have a close-up, and that means something. They can have an establishing shot, that means something. They can have a tracking shot, they can, the intercut between scenes, and they have this whole language that helps them tell a narrative, and all of that has gone away, and all of a sudden you just have this expanse. And so how do you deal with that? How do you get used to that? Audio is a huge part of that, and Albert's going to be doing a deep dive into that a little bit later. But it's a completely different world. The word that comes up a lot when people talk about VR is presence. And it has to be a really good experience for that to feel it, but if you're in a really good VR experience, you feel like you're there. Another word that comes up a lot is empathy, which is kind of an extension of presence, but it's like, and especially if you're looking at the subject matter, the UN VR team presented at Storycode a few months ago, a really great presentation, and they were talking about some of the documentary work that they were doing, and their empathy quotient just went sort of through the roof, and their donations went up as a result of that, things like Clouds Over Cedra. People saw it and were kind of sobbing at the end of it. So it's a very powerful medium, but it's one that you need to, handle carefully. And we were just talking earlier before, like horror in VR is just terrifying. I can't do it. It's like, there's going to be someone creeping up behind you. But I'm going to dive in a little bit more into what the experience of VR actually is. There's sort of 10 main attributes I'm going to step through. Some of them are kind of in opposition to each other. Some of them can work with each other. And then I'm going to talk about at the end how those attributes are going to apply to our project. So the first one, sort of a fairly obvious one, is cinematic and/or CGI. I say and/or because you can have experiences with both. Again, the gamers have a bit of a head start here. They've been working in 3D for a long time. They've been thinking about navigating through worlds for a long time. Cinema, not so much. You know, it's sort of like really starting from ground zero and just saying, how can we have this new language when we have this sort of 360 spherical image, and then it's going to another sort of different 360 spherical image. I would recommend, if people are interested in diving into this a bit more, Jessica Brillhart, who's the principal VR filmmaker at Google, has a great series of articles on Medium that talk about this in a lot more detail, especially the way you can kind of direct attention in VR, and worth a look. And there's actually, I saw a great example recently, an Australian film, but I'm from Australia in case you didn't realise, a film called Collision, which mixes cinematic VR and computer animation in a really effective way. So it's not like you have to do one or the other, and you can mix both in a really effective way. Next up is fixed POV, point of view, or 6 degrees of freedom. 6 degrees of freedom is really just left, right, forwards, backwards, and up, down. And probably the easiest way to think about this is to just think about the two main high-end HMDs that are on the market at the moment, which is Oculus and the HTC Vive. And the Vive actually comes with 2 base stations that have motion detectors in them. And if you have, New York apartments probably don't have this so much, but if you have 15 square feet of space with not too much in it, you can set up your motion detectors, and then you all of a sudden, if the experience is designed for that, you can put on your HMD and you can walk around, you can touch objects, you can kind of be fully immersed. And that feels like obviously a much more real experience than a static one where you're sitting, everyone recommends sitting in a swivel chair so you can turn around and look, but it's not the same as if you're actually walking around and exploring. And also, actually, for people who don't have an HTC Vive, there's an amazing experience at the moment at Madame Tussauds, the Ghostbusters virtual reality experience, which is designed by a company called The Void, and it's precisely that kind of walking around and sliming ghosts. And I haven't done it yet, but apparently it's amazing. I'm going to try and do it in the next couple of days. Next up, a more obvious one is just either to shoot 2D or stereoscopic or 3D. And this applies obviously more to cinematic than to CGI. CGI by default pretty much works in 3D. But again, it's possible to have both in the one experience and even in the one shot. We were looking at a camera rig the other day where it has sort of 2D on the horizontal axis, 3D on the horizontal axis, and then 2D on the vertical axis. So when you look up, they call it the zenith in VR, but when you look up to the kind of the top of the sphere, that can be in 2D, because most of the stuff, not our project, and Noah will talk about that in a minute, but most experiences, when you look up, there's nothing there. And so obviously 3D works more when you have a foreground object and a background that you can kind of see that against, and you sense that depth. So you have 3D on the horizontal axis, and then transition to 2D when you kind of look up. The thing about 3D, especially at the moment, is that stitching is a nightmare. It's hard enough for 2D, depending on what camera rigs you're using. But with 3D, it's an order of magnitude more, because you actually are stitching for each eye. You have left eye and right eye. You have 14 cameras, and you're trying to do all of that in post. And it's a very frustrating thing to do. Again, in a year or two, Google's already, with their jump camera, they're allowing you to shoot footage and then upload it to the cloud. And they'll kind of, their algorithms will do the stitching for you, and then the next morning you download it again and you have your footage. That is obviously going to become much more common. So stitching is going to go away at some point, but until it does, just be very aware that 3D has that extra complexity. 2D and or 3D audio, again, you can have both in this experience, but if you're going to the trouble of doing 3D audio, then you should probably just do it through the whole experience. I'm not going to go into this too much because Albert's really going to do an amazing deep dive on that. But the one thing I would say is that audio in VR, it carries at least 50% of the weight in terms of the narrative and directing attention, directing meaning. If you get a chance to see it, I don't know if people have the Samsung Gear, but Notes on Blindness has just been released for the Samsung Gear, and I saw it at Tribeca a few months ago, but it's an amazing piece and uses audio really well. Okay, and then the last one is linear or interactive. This is again a binary one. If you make an interactive element in your piece, in your experience, then by definition the whole thing becomes interactive. And it's an interesting one because I think going back to the TV, cinema versus gaming, you would say that the TV and cinema experiences are obviously linear, and sometimes called lean back experiences, and then gaming is more interactive and lean forward. The web as well, and so there's been this distinction drawn between the two. I think in VR, even when you have a linear experience, it's still, because you're being immersed and because of that powerful feeling of presence, you're much more engaged. So it feels like it's kind of a lean forward medium, even if you're, you know, in a linear experience. So, and one great example of a cinematic piece that was done with interactive elements is Gone. Again, it was something that was developed for the Samsung Gear. It was the people behind The Walking Dead who produced it, so they had a bit of a budget to do it. But they have these interactive hotspots in the videos where you kind of, it's like a little cul-de-sac and you go into it and there are clues revealed when you do that, and then you pull back and you're back in the main narrative again. And if you don't follow those clues, then, you know, I watched the whole thing and I got to the end and I thought, you know, I'm going to watch it again because I need to watch some more of those clues, because it's, at the end, it's not at all what you're expecting. It's kind of an interesting kind of twist. So again, something worth checking out. So where does yes fit into this landscape? Well, we've decided, and we've had a lot of talks about this, and Noah and team have been doing some tests, on a camera test as well, but of those attributes, we're going to be cinematic, we're going to have a fixed POV, definitely going to do 2D video, and when you see our subject matter, you'll see why we've gone with that choice. But we're going to be leaning a lot on 3D audio, and we're going to be feeling like, you know, the audio is going to be doing a lot, both in terms of directing attention, but also just in terms of telling the story. Like when your head tracks to a different character, then the audio can kind of follow that character and tell that story more. And then finally, it's going to be a linear experience as well, but as I said, a linear experience, but an engaged one. So we'd love to come back and tell you how it went. And now on to Noah.
Really quickly, let's do some questions. Raise your hands. Who's worn a headset before in VR here? Okay. Who's shot VR material on any sort of camera? Great. Now the next one is a binary choice. On the one hand, we have raise your hand if you're here for details very relevant to right now, and the other hand is raise your hand if you're here for the bigger picture and trying to understand how to understand. So let's do details. You guys. Okay, and who's here for the bigger picture? All right, cool. It's gonna be good. All right, here we go. So, yes, trust, love, and human celebration from 30 feet up is a different kind of dog. Have you ever been in a VR experience, looked up at the ceiling, and thought, damn, there's nothing happening there? Have you ever been to the box or Cirque du Soleil and been amazed at what humans can do? Have you ever checked your Facebook feed or watched the news and thought, this is not good? This caustic, overwhelming, judgmental certainty and negativity does not help me to contribute to the world in the way that I want. If you answered yes to even one of these questions, then yes is a documentary for you. Yes is a story exploring creative love and the love of creating, the challenges that partners work through and the bond that these two powerful women share and how that bond affects their community. Anya is one of the founders of the event space and aerial space, party space, House of Yes, and Melissa is a professional aerialist performer. Just 1 year ago they met, and together they've worked through ending relationships with their previous partners, opening up the new House of Yes, and now they spend most of every day and every night at House of Yes. They also have a new show related to our conversations and work so far on the documentary. So Yes is a 4-minute live-action spherical project with 3D audio, and we went through a lot of that. So Yes is some comparisons here. Kurosawa's Dreams, Errol Morris, and Avatar, okay? I'm gonna break this down for you. It's Kurosawa's Dreams because of the magic realism, the multiple narratives, and the awesome costuming and storytelling. I know, we're setting the bar high here. I'm aware, but we're gonna aim up. Errol Morris for the profound interview styles, the active listening that lets people reveal themselves, the chance for subjects to explore ideas and for us to be a part of their own internal exploration. And Avatar, because Avatar explores 3D axes. It's actually one of the first films where, if you remember them, if you saw it, bouncing off the leaves and going down and they're in a CGI space, but they were using a lot of new technology to be able to run over those hills and up in a really interesting way. So set the bar high. All right, here we go. So why this story? There's two reasons. A story that could only be understood in VR, and a story that will create validated learning. And by only understood in VR, in my conversations with Anya and Melissa, Anya said, you feel like you've swum out into the ocean farther than you should go, and you don't know if you can make it back to shore. But you have your partner there with you, so you know no matter what, even if you don't make it back, it will be okay. For me personally, to be at the House of Yes is an experience like no other. The kindness, the camaraderie, celebrating being human. I feel like this is a story that needs to be told. I feel like it's a story that people need, even if they don't know that they need it. And I am profoundly fortunate to be alive and be human, as all of you are as well. And I wanted to help create something that could celebrate the ways that we're human. The last note I'll say on this is it's a really inclusive space. It's a space where people come together, not necessarily because they're really rich and can afford a ticket. There's free tickets in before 11 p.m. I've always, when I've been there, I've felt like people come together not in ignorance of all of the hardships of life, but in celebration of being together. So that's the first part. The second part that I'm about to drill down into is validated learning. Our team needs to learn. This stuff is profoundly complicated. If anybody tells you anything different, then ask to see their work and be really impressed, or think maybe there's more to learn. I wanted to find a story also with artists that could actually understand this process of trying to figure out. Anya and Melissa are always working on this project. I don't know if flattered is the right word, but it's really cool that I had some part of inspiring them and see it being a reflection of their relationship. I needed partners on this because it's hard to do. They're also an inspiration. I spoke a little bit about that, and I really respect people who can be positive in the way they are. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing. So the term validated learning from Eric Rice and the Lean Startup. I work with Techstars. I work with our company works a lot with both startups and people in the tech industry trying to do things in a lean approach. This is something personally I learned there. Validated learning, a process in which one learns by trying out an initial idea and measuring it to validate the effect. Each test of an idea is a single iteration in a larger process of many iterations whereby something is learnt and then applied to succeeding tests. Meeting the team that is working on this documentary was part of my learning when I was like, I can't figure some of this stuff out, I need a lot of help. So that's one thing. The next thing, a problem should only be solved once. This is like hacker ethos. There's a lot of problems in the world. Once you figure it out, share it. Personally, the more secret some of this stuff is, the more I think it's not actually that profound and secret, and you're just hiding the fact that it's okay, and like the rest of the stuff. So kind of synthesizing those ideas, we're dealing with a new storytelling medium. Comparisons to other mediums are odious. Do not be fooled. The project with the most learning will consist of a series of experiments designed to validate a series of hypotheses. And we should share what we know and welcome the input from others. So everything that we do today and in the future will be as much as possible open source. We encourage you telling us how we've made mistakes, how we can grow. That's the most interesting to us, but also sharing the parts you like. We learn from that too. So the original hypotheses we're thinking of, we must have a reason to look up and a reason to look down. Sound and blocking are the primary reasons for audiences to move their head. The camera must move, but can't make people sit. The stories we tell in VR must be totally impossible to tell using classical cinematic visual and sound techniques. So what I'm going to walk you through now is our updated hypotheses, what we've validated and what we don't know yet. Cool. 1, we must have a reason to look up and a reason to look down. Validated. So what that means to me as a director and for all of you is when you find yourself looking around in a space, when you find yourself looking up and down, when you turn your head, hold on to that moment. That is a moment that could only happen in VR. In the language of filmmakers, and it's really challenging to look up. If you think of Spider-Man, you don't just look up and see Spider-Man. You follow this like drooping, like there's a grate on the floor and you see that and the water's dripping and you go up and then there's like a ladder and then there's Spider-Man because this action is really a problem. What you see there are some images. One of the first tests I did is I gave a bunch of artists a 360 still camera. I asked them to take photos of themselves in their space. Why? Because I grew up looking at and being fascinated by pictures of Picasso in his studio, artists at work, Louise Nevelson in front of a giant statue. But I always wondered, I'm like, where's the bathroom? Like, are people watching them? What's going on behind them? And I was like, okay, this is something people would want to see, is like what's around an artist when they work. Also, artists hang things from a ceiling sometimes, which is pretty cool. Great. Our next updated hypothesis: sound, character, focus, framing, blocking, that's strike through, so we're going to get rid of that. I'll talk about that. Are the primary reasons to move, for an audience to move their head. Both of these images are from Jessica Brillart, who's from Google. It's really cool because she's a really awesome writer. I'm excited to see the piece that she makes of VR that moves me or inspires me, but I respect her. You should read her blogs. She's also coming up with a visual language for editing. The two things you see there are why I crossed out blocking and replaced it with framing. On the left is an image that shows edits working outward. So the first edit you would see, the first image is white, then red, then green, and then you'll see points of interest, and her argument is that aligning these points of interest is the job of the editor. To the right, you'll see how she did that, and when I say how cool she is, but how much work we have to go, and if you know Jessica, tell her I'm sorry, but also I'd like to meet her. She lined up somebody on a mountain and somebody in a cable car. Why, I don't know. It's travel footage. That's a nice thing about nature documentaries. It's all beautiful, and you can cut them together, but it's a great way to learn. So that's kind of how we dealt with that hypothesis. The next one, updated hypothesis. The camera must move, but can't make people sick. That's a robot that we made to move the camera around that was really shaky and would make you vomit. I've actually never seen it in a headset because looking at it on my iPhone and 360 was enough. Now the robot is better, it's smoother, we've done some work on it, but this is all part of the process. And again, I'm gonna keep coming back to this. If you're not failing, you're probably not trying hard enough. You should grow very, very, very comfortable with nothing working out. I've learned how to attach small wheels to things. I've learned a little bit about vibration dampening. I've learned about high-end RC cars, and it's still not done yet, but it's part of our practice. A few other little things that we've learned with this. When I said let's not make people sick, let's not make 9 out of 10 people sick. That's just a realistic thing, as people have different sensitivities, one, and two, a lot of studies on motion and simulation making people sick. The US military has done a lot of this work. Fun, interesting fact, if you haven't flown an F-16 in a while, you have to go to a simulator because you will be disoriented if you do not practice first. So something to know is the more time you spend in a VR world, the more acclimated to these changing perspectives and the disconnectedness you'll get. Something I learned pretty early on. Along with the motion stuff, we're working on cranes, and we have a huge amount of vertical movement. Finding the right speed, the right tempo for that, and that in relationship to the characters is really hard. It's really hard to do. We're working on it. Cool. The next image, if you look in the bottom right corner, you'll see me with a boom trying to figure out what we're doing here. Updated hypothesis. There I am in the corner. The stories we tell in VR must be totally impossible to tell using classical cinematic visuals and sound techniques. There's really cool stuff out there, but when it comes to cinematic VR, we're still watching a train approaching the station, which is super cool, super cool. The best filmmakers in the world are not really releasing a lot of their stuff yet because it's really hard. If Steven Spielberg kind of hints that it's complicated, it's probably complicated. Dude's a good storyteller, right? He knows how to make things we like. So how are we gonna make this impossible to experience in any other way? Well, I referenced Kurosawa. I don't think this will be your typical documentary. I don't know, there are documentaries exploring relationships between two people and fears and trust. We're gonna do some of this where you get binary choices. You have to pick between who you're focusing on and listening to. It's gonna be wild, and I struggle for the words to describe it as we work to make kind of a new vocabulary. Personally, a challenge with all of this is when we do our commercial work, it's pretty slick. We're selling stuff, it looks good. I'm trying to loosen it up. What I love about Anya and Melissa when we're with them is the show must go on. I've learned a lot from that. They're performing every night, either them or people, and it must continue forward. For those of you that needed really clear practical advice, the next slide I'm going to show you is this. So one thing I want to share is this is something that I really, really firmly learned 12 days ago, 15 days ago, 16 days ago when we were shooting tests. Yeah, so add a new thing. You have exposure, okay? You have focus, like you have hitting record. These are the basics of film. Stitch lines, oh my God, what's going on? So what happens is each of these cameras overlaps, okay? And then in post, you need to prioritize which one of them is going to be in front of the other. The blue represents the camera, and if you'll notice, the red lines kind of correspond to that pentagon-y shape. That's where people can't really be doing a lot of stuff. That's where you don't want someone holding a stick. You want to try to move through those spaces quickly and efficiently. You want to block around those spaces, and I learned that by using one of these cameras, because before that, we were using a camera that looks like this. Now, I don't know how many of you are directors here of anything? Okay, right. You got to answer a lot of questions, some of which you're like, I'm totally prepared, here's the answer. Others, you're like, what do you mean that light doesn't work? Or where is that person? Well, now try bending an overlapping field of view in some weird shape. It stresses me out just looking at it, and I learned it the other week. You got to try it. It's really hard to do. Cool. Don't do that. Don't get those. Get the ones that line up straight. Just firm advice. Great, 6 out of 7. So here's another fun one. This one, actually, this presentation is what's brought me to this realization. Something will need to be very close. Things too close in VR are magical. This is inspired by a new piece of work from Primrose, an amazing studio you should keep your eyes on. The Rose and I, and when you get to play with it, there's a tiny planet, but the planet isn't right here. It's like right here. And so you're kind of leaning back and looking at it, which made me realize that the most effective piece of VR filmmaking I've ever made, the only piece of filmmaking that could never be replicated in regular cinema with any budget, was when I was in Thailand with my amazing fiance. And we saw really large mammals, elephants, okay? I'm not a selfie person. I have no interest in having selfies. But I was holding the camera and I'd been feeding the elephant bananas, and it thought the camera was a banana. So what you can see if you watch this is you can see me squealing like a child with delight as an elephant attempts to eat my VR camera. Okay? And it's funny, but it's profound, right? It made me share my experience in a way that I normally don't. I hold this in my mind and I use it in my material, but I don't share it. It made me see myself as delighted as a child, which was really amazing. And like in life, which I'll get into in a second, you have to pick. You can watch the elephant or you can watch me. They're both fantastic. Probably most of you would vote for the elephant, but I'm definitely there, and it's part of my story. And what was cool and what I want to pull together is I had to see the work of very experienced VR creators to be reminded of why this piece was wonderful. And I just figured it out. I mean, it's been 100 hours, okay? So hopefully that hypothesis won't change. Would you address one? Go for it, sure.
Sorry, no, I just had one quick question about this. I've been shooting a lot of stuff too. And this shot would be great in conventional film. And for the perspective of cinematic film, not CG, not interactive, do you feel like, because you say don't compare to other mediums at all, there is something that translates from the conventional film, meaning this would be a great shot conventionally too, for all the same reasons. The effect would probably be magnified and much more exciting, but
Well,
the raw basis of it, the reason why it might work, I think
Are you talking about the shot that you see right there on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so that shot right there, right? The director in me says,
Just has that-
no, I know, and so I'm gonna set it up. The way I would use a fisheye lens like that with black around it, right, is our character, after many, many months of drug-induced stupor on some tropical island, meets their perfect partner. And all of a sudden, in a series of shots, we realize that they're coming out of their druggy haze and actually back into the real world. And yet there's still these little bits of this trippy iconography we set up before, and then we see, in a moment of joy, something that is both hallucinogenic, trippy, and makes no sense, which is this shot, but also has both of those characters, but you still wouldn't do what I said, which is have to make a choice between who you see. Right? So this is cool, and I zoomed out like this, but this isn't the experience. Just so everybody knows, this is 2 images stitched together using a really cheap camera, the Roche Theta. I recommend you get one if you're interested. It's $300. There's many better cameras. Almost every camera is better, but this one is easy, and you will learn what you're doing, as I have learned, or you'll learn what you did and how it applies to what you might do, which is more accurate. This is 2 images in a sphere stitched together, and then I just manipulated it so it looked cool. So I wouldn't say no, but I wouldn't say yes. Moving on, updated hypothesis. Something must sound like it is above and below us. For those of you that wanted technical information, Albert is about to give you a master class, so I'm just going to leave this one for right now. Just a couple more slides, really quickly. So, Sergei Eisenstein, Battleship Potemkin, the first people to use editing. One of the first movies to get banned, which is awesome. When people hate your work, it means that they responded to it, right? That's super cool. I hope to make a piece of cinema banned someday. More people, the better, right? He said, language is much closer to film than painting is. Why? This is a hypothesis, but I think because people were saying, oh, it's like a moving painting, right? That locomotive coming towards you is like a painting of a locomotive, but it moves. And he was like, no, that's wrong. That's not what's going on. Wait until you see me edit stuff. And people were like, what's editing? And he was like, I'm going to take one thing, put it next to another thing. And people were like, that will make no sense, and people will be confused. But we aren't. And now nobody would watch a movie where Leonardo DiCaprio is like, okay, I'll see you in Berlin. And then for 6 hours you sat in an airplane with Leonardo DiCaprio. He got out of the airplane, waited 20 more minutes for his luggage. Well, it would just be dumb. In fact, it is dumb. In fact, don't start your movie with people waking up unless you really know what you're doing, because that's not how it works. So my question is, is much closer to virtual reality than cinema. And so far what I have is this. And it might change tomorrow or after you ask us some questions, which is empathy is much closer to virtual reality than cinema is, or the paradoxical nature of human experience is much closer to virtual reality than cinema is. Why? Because when we make cinema, we say, oh, but what's virtual reality? We say, oh no, what's gonna happen behind me? What if I wanna look this other way? People don't like that. They don't like feeling like they're missing something. Maybe you're mad at me right now for turning the wrong way, right? And what's really tough for us as humans to realize is that happens all the time. That's real life. Right now behind you is half of New York City. And it's a little disconcerting when you really think about the fact that almost everything that will exist in your lifetime you have no idea about. And holding that mirror up is like, it gets to you inside, in the animal part of us, in the part of us that's scared about things happening behind us. So I leave you with this, which is a 33,000-year-old cave painting that to me looks pretty modern, contemporary, and like somebody who is capturing emotion. So to the directors out there, or the people working with directors, and this is probably why I'm a director, the profession of a film director can and should be such a high, precious one that no person aspiring to it can disregard any knowledge that will make them a better film director or a human being.